Morning, everyone. For the sake of brevity, I think I have 10 minutes here. I'll try to use my time wisely. I would like to focus on three things during my presentation before we take questions in the panel, I believe. First, what I call the self-serving yet necessary evil part of the presentation, discussion on Icelandair Group and its role in the Arctic region. Second, the importance of cooperation between the Arctic nations in promoting tourism and the direct positive economic effects tourism can surely yield. Lastly, what I call the inherent opportunities for the indigenous peoples that can be achieved by strengthening the underlying tourism pillars of the economy. But first, a brief introduction on Icelandair Group, and more importantly, its relevance to today's discussion. On the slide behind me, we see that an overlay of the route network of Icelandair and Air Iceland reveals that Icelandair Group has extensive interests in the Arctic region, and more importantly, what I call willingness to continue to push the frontiers. Iceland's unique location between Europe and North America is the key to Icelandair's hub and spoke network that you can see on the slide behind me. It basically works like this. It connects 25 cities in Europe with 15 gateways in the US and Canada through Icelandair's hub in Iceland. It's based on a 24-hour rotation. A plane leaves Iceland early in the morning for Europe, only to return later in the day, continuing onwards westwards to the US, returning early next morning. And this is how it goes every day, 365 days a year. In addition to this, and this has even more relevance to today's discussion, is the regional network connecting 6 destinations in Greenland and 1 destination in Faroe Islands with Iceland. And as such, Iceland partly becomes a natural hub for the Faroe Islands and Greenland to markets in the US and Europe. And we say Air Iceland is a key airline in the West Nordic area. If we look at the numbers and just contemplate what has been happening over the course of the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen an aggregate 15–20% annual growth in the number of tourists coming from Iceland into Greenland. And my personal view is that we haven't even started to scratch the surface of possibilities in directing tourists from Iceland to Greenland. But as was noted in the last speech here, this has to be done in a very contained and responsible manner. In my view, it is vital, it's important and vital to market Iceland and Greenland as a part of the same package. What does that entail? That means that one should not visit either without visiting the other. And this rhymes well, for example, with Asian travel preferences to visit more than one country in when they go abroad. In a way, we can say Iceland is likewise the natural window for Greenlanders wishing to travel abroad, to use that connectivity model to go from Greenland to Iceland and then to up to 60 different destinations throughout the world. And we can continue to leverage that opportunity going forward. And we see in our forward estimates, for example, there is increasing demand for Greenland and the Arctic from key markets in the US, in China, in Japan, and Taiwan. And we are stern believers in this continued interest in those leading market segments. The significance of this route network and how it's an overlay over the Arctic region, it cannot be underestimated, in my view, in the future development of the Arctic, and the route network will continue to act as a catalyst for specialization and freer movement of capital, and of course, continued increase in tourism. If we look at the Iceland-Greenland connection, in my mind, there's an obvious connection between Iceland and Greenland in this respect. And there are joint interests for the countries to deepen their ties with increased cooperation. Icelanders can surely contribute significantly in terms of infrastructure, and I agree that the approach should always be based on mutual interest and on knowledge sharing. that is key to taking these two countries forward. I certainly second the idea that was voiced here yesterday by Okaliki Gesiak, the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, in the opening session, that cooperation in the Arctic region is and will remain the key to future success. And most importantly, the cooperation should always be based on equality. This is a parable, and I believe that we should let history be our teacher once again. Successful bilateral business relationships are a two-way street. And nowadays, some kind of joint ventures where both parties gain from cooperation should be the norm in developing sustainable tourism infrastructure in the Arctic region. I do argue that the same should be the approach for the Arctic states towards Greenland, with knowledge sharing at the forefront of cooperation with Greenland. In my mind, there's a clear trend forming in tourism worldwide, and it has direct relevance to today's discussion. The extraordinary changes that are taking place, for example, in the Icelandic economy over the last half decade, where tourism and aviation has become the singular, most important pillar of the economy, with the number of tourists to Iceland more than doubling over the course of the last 5 years. What does this mean? For example, if we disaggregate the economic contribution of the main pillars in Iceland, fisheries, aluminum, hydroelectric power generation, and of course tourism, it reveals that tourism has, within a span of only a few years, surpassed the other pillars in the economy in its contribution in export revenues. And linking this back to the discussion that took place here yesterday, I do believe that this is comparable to the situation here in Greenland. But in order to achieve that, we really have to believe that this is achievable. I believe there's a lesson to be learned from all of this. If we can do it, others can do it as well. And the key to unlocking the potential of tourism lies in its infrastructure. The proposed lengthening, for example, of the runways in Nuuk and Ilulissat to 2.2 kilometers is a colossal step in the right direction. Build the infrastructure, build it, and they will come, they said in a Hollywood movie a few years back. I believe that rings true today as well. To conclude, I want to highlight two important points for the overall economic development of the Arctic states. First, tourism can act as a catalyst to preserve the way of life for the indigenous people of the Arctic region. In tourism, there's a premium being paid for authenticity, and tourism can be a balancing act, in my view, with the increased industrial activity in the region. The long-term trend in tourism is preservation, and more importantly, tourism gives us tools to for locals to market their products to a wider group of people, hence strengthening and fostering the core of the local communities. Secondly, and on a more high-level note, there's a recent study by Oxford Economics, and it revealed that the improvement in aviation connectivity contributes significantly to the overall economic performance of the wider economy through enhancing the overall level of productivity. What does this mean, and how is it relevant for today's discussion? These improvements, we can see them in firms outside the aviation sector, and it comes through two main channels. First, through the effect on the domestic firms, which have increased access to foreign markets. And this is applicable not only in Iceland, but in Greenland and every country within the Arctic region. And secondly, it has to do with increased foreign competition in the home market. And therefore, through the freer movement of investment capital and workers between those countries. Aviation connectivity is key to this, and the key to aviation connectivity is infrastructure. Therefore, I applaud the decision to lengthen the runways. Finally, I want to tell you this. The future holds a premium being paid for authenticity, and my personal view is that collectively the Arctic states should safeguard that authenticity and focus on quality, not quantity, when it comes to leveraging the tourism opportunities ahead. Thank you all.